The scent of lilies and something older, something like damp earth and forgotten sorrows, still clings to my clothes, a permanent stain from my nights at Hollowvale Mortuary. They say Ethelburg is a town that breathes history, but I think it suffocates on it, each cobblestone a monument to a grief that never quite fades. I returned not by choice, but by a chain of circumstances forged in loss and obligation, the links clinking with the ghost of my sister Emily's laughter. Her memory is a splinter in my heart, a constant ache that drew me back to this place where shadows stretch longer and whispers ride the evening mist like spectral couriers, carrying messages no sane mind would wish to receive. Ethelburg. Even the name tastes of wood smoke and regret. It's a town nestled in a valley that seems to perpetually hold its breath, surrounded by ancient woods that crowd its edges like silent, brooding sentinels. The houses huddle together, their windows like vacant eyes, staring out at streets where joy seems to tiptoe, afraid to make too much noise. It was here Emily vanished, her bright spirit extinguished, only for her body to be found days later by the Weeping Willow Creek, under circumstances the town coroner politely termed inconclusive, but which local folklore had already woven into a far darker tapestry, threads of old fears and whispered warnings about what walks the moonless nights. My mother, a woman once vibrant, withered after Emily's passing. Her decline was a slow, agonizing descent into a twilight of illness, her body mirroring the decay of our family's hope. The medical bills piled up like autumn leaves, heavy and suffocating, and my meager savings from a life I'd tried to build away from Ethelburg dwindled to almost nothing. So I came back, hat in hand, the prodigal son returning not to celebration, but to the quiet desperation of a town that had already taken too much. The only place offering immediate, if grim, employment was Hollowvale Mortuary, a sprawling Victorian edifice on the town's periphery, its silhouette a jagged tear against the bruised twilight sky. Hollowvale. The name itself felt like a premonition. It stood guard over Ethelburg's sprawling cemetery, a city of the dead that seemed more populous and certainly more animated in its stillness than the town of the living it overlooked. I remembered it from childhood, a place of hushed reverence and a bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the weather. It was also, according to the faded police report I'd read 100 times, the last place Emily had been seen by anyone outside our family, drawn by some childish dare or morbid curiosity, a detail that gnawed at me with relentless teeth. Perhaps, I told myself, working within its walls would offer some clue, some echo of her final moments. The air in Ethelburg is different, thicker, like breathing in a forgotten memory. The wind, sighing through the gnarled branches of the ancient oaks, carries fragments of conversations that ended centuries ago. The townsfolk are a study in polite reserve, their eyes quick to assess, their smiles fleeting, particularly when the name Hollowvale is mentioned. It's a place spoken of in lowered tones, a repository not just of bodies, but of the town's collective anxieties, its unspoken histories. I felt their gazes follow me, the newcomer who was also an old wound reopened, Ethan Walker, brother of the lost girl, now seeking solace or perhaps something more sinister in the very heart of Ethelburg's sorrow. I needed the money. That was the truth I clung to, the practical anchor in a sea of grief and unease. But another, deeper current pulled me towards Hollowvale's imposing shadowed door. It was the unanswered questions surrounding Emily, the void her absence left, a void that seemed to have its own gravitational pull, drawing me into the orbit of this town's oldest, most somber institution. The thought of spending my nights surrounded by the dead should have been repellent, Yet there was a perverse logic to it, a sense of confronting the inevitable, of walking willingly into the darkness that had swallowed my sister. The mortuary itself seemed to absorb the light, its dark wood and stained glass windows filtering the world into muted, melancholic hues. Even in daylight, its long corridors felt like passages into an older, sadder realm. The silence within was not peaceful, but expectant, as if the very walls were listening, waiting. Each creak of the floorboards, each sigh of the wind against the eaves, sounded like a coded message, a secret language spoken only by the house and its permanent residents. This was where I would earn my keep, in this mausoleum of fading flowers and whispered condolences. I often wonder if some places are destined to be wounds on the landscape, points where the veil between worlds wears thin, not through malice, but through an accumulation of sorrow, like a fabric repeatedly soaked in tears until it frays and parts. Ethelberg felt like such a place, and Hollowvale Mortuary its deepest, most tender point. My return was a pilgrimage to the heart of that wound, driven by a brother's guilt and a desperate hope for answers, or perhaps just for an end to the haunting refrain of "what if" that played endlessly in the quiet chambers of my mind. What I couldn't have known then, as I first crossed Hollowvale's threshold, was that the dead of Ethelberg had their own agenda, their own grievances, and that the quietude of their slumber was a carefully maintained and increasingly fragile illusion. The shadows in this town held more than just memories, they held teeth. And I was about to learn, in the most visceral way imaginable, what happens when those shadows decide they've been silent for far too long. Could I have turned away, even then, if I'd sensed the true depth of the abyss I was stepping into? Mr. Charles Whitmore, proprietor of Hollowvale Mortuary, was a man sculpted from shadows and weariness. His office, paneled in dark, age-stained oak, smelled of old paper, beeswax, and something indefinably funereal, a scent that seemed to have seeped into his very being. He sat behind a massive desk, a relic from a more ornate era, his face a roadmap of sleepless nights and unspoken burdens. His eyes, though, were what held me. They were deep-set, the color of a stormy sky, and seemed to carry the weight of generations of Ethelberg's departed. He didn't so much interview me as appraise me, a long, silent scrutiny that made the hairs on my neck prickle. "The work here, Mr. Walker," he began, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder, "is not for everyone. It requires a certain temperament, a respect for the house and for those it shelters." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "And it requires adherence to the rules, implicitly." He gestured vaguely towards a small, leather-bound ledger on his desk, its pages yellowed and brittle. "Hollowvale has its traditions, its ways of maintaining harmony. These are not suggestions. They are essential for the peace of this establishment, and, I dare say, for your own." The gravity in his tone was absolute, leaving no room for misinterpretation. It was Mrs. Helen Brooks, the mortuary's receptionist, and a woman who seemed as ancient and permanent as the building itself, who presented me with the list. Her face was a delicate web of wrinkles, her eyes like polished agates, sharp and knowing. She moved with a surprising bird-like quickness. She didn't offer a handshake, just a curt nod as she slid a single, folded sheet of parchment across the reception counter. The paper felt old, the ink faded in places, the script an elegant, spidery hand. "The rules, Mr. Walker," she said, her voice a dry whisper like rustling leaves. "Mr. Whitmore is particular, as he should be." Then, leaning closer, her gaze intensified, and a chill snaked down my spine. "The rules are for them, Rapaz," she added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur, her eyes darting briefly towards the shadowed hallway leading to the viewing rooms. "To keep them settled. But they don't like to obey any." I unfolded the parchment later, in the dim solitude of the small, sparsely furnished room allotted to the night assistant. The rules were unlike anything I could have imagined, a bizarre litany of rituals and responses that seemed to belong more to a forgotten grimoire than an employee handbook. Each one hinted at a world just beneath the surface of Hollowvale, a world where the departed were not merely passive residents. The first few were unsettling enough, speaking of whispers and specific responses, as if engaging in a nightly, coded conversation with the unseen. I felt a prickle of dread as I read them, the words seeming to writhe on the ancient paper. Rule 1. Upon hearing whispers in the corridors between the hours of 2 and 4 in the morning, you are to respond clearly, but without undue emphasis, with the phrase, "The stars watch over your slumber, and I watch over the house." No other words are to be spoken. Direct engagement beyond this phrase is inadvisable. The implication was chilling, that the whispers expected and perhaps demanded a reply. What if I fumbled the words, or worse, what if they replied in turn? The thought sent a shiver through me, a cold premonition of the nights to come. Rule 2. Should a coffin in any of the viewing rooms exhibit tremors or shift its position, however slightly, it must be immediately covered with the shroud of silence, which is kept in the East linen cabinet. You are to remain in absolute silence for a full 7 minutes thereafter. Under no circumstances are you to look directly at the coffin during this period. The Shroud of Silence. The name itself was a masterpiece of macabre understatement. What kind of tremor were we talking about? And why the injunction against looking? My imagination, already working overtime, conjured images I desperately tried to suppress. Rule 3. The offering drawer, located within the small chapel alcove, must never be found empty. If, upon your nightly inspection, it is so, you must deposit within it an object of personal significance, something that carries a memory of loss or profound regret, before the next chiming of the old tower clock. My hand instinctively went to my pocket, where I often carried a small, worn blue ribbon, Emily's favorite. The idea of surrendering such a precious memento to some unseen, demanding entity in a dusty drawer filled me with a sudden, fierce protectiveness and a fresh wave of grief. This rule felt like a violation, a demand too personal, too cruel. Rule 4. If the lights in the preparation room extinguish themselves without apparent cause, you are to light the salt lantern. Fuel and wicks are in the pantry, and audibly recite the threshold chant 3 times. Do not attempt to restore electrical power until the chant is complete and the lantern has burned for at least 10 minutes. The preparation room. Even the name was a euphemism for things best left unconsidered. A salt lantern, a threshold chant. These were not the protocols of a modern mortuary. They were the rituals of an older, darker faith, designed to ward off what exactly? The list continued, each rule more bizarre and more unsettling than the last, painting a picture of a nightly vigil fraught with unseen perils and arcane obligations. The final rule, about the old organ playing by itself, felt like a descent into pure Gothic horror. As I sat there, the weight of Hollowvale seemed to settle upon me, its ancient dust and sorrows pressing in. This wasn't just a job, it was a descent. And Mrs. Brooks' words echoed in my mind. They don't like to obey anymore. My first night at Hollowvale Mortuary began with a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence, a heavy cloak woven from shadows and unspoken grief. I moved through the dimly lit corridors, a solitary sentinel in a kingdom of the sleeping, the list of rules clutched in my hand like a fragile talisman. The air was cold, carrying the cloying sweetness of funeral wreaths and the sharper, metallic tang from the preparation room, a combination that churned my stomach. I performed the initial checks with a forced composure, my senses hyper-alert, every creak of the ancient floorboards, every sigh of the wind against. It was just after 2 in the morning, the hour stipulated by Rule 1, when the whispers began. They were faint at first, like the rustling of dry leaves or the sibilant hiss of gas escaping an old pipe, seeming to emanate from the very walls themselves. I froze, straining to decipher them, but they remained just beyond the threshold of comprehension, a chorus of murmurs that slithered through the oppressive quiet. My heart hammered against my ribs. Steeling myself, I recited the prescribed phrase, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the vast emptiness. The stars watch over your slumber, and I watch over the house. The response was not silence, as I had perhaps foolishly hoped. Instead, the whispers intensified, coalescing into something that sounded disturbingly like derision. A low, collective chuckle, dry and brittle, seemed to echo from the end of the long, shadowed corridor leading to the oldest wing of the mortuary. It was a sound that mocked my carefully enunciated words, a clear, chilling indication that my attempt at appeasement had not only failed, but had, perhaps, been perceived as an affront. Rule 1 offered no contingency for laughter. I stood rooted to the spot, the cold dread blooming in my chest, the parchment in my hand suddenly feeling utterly useless. Later, as I made my rounds of the viewing rooms, my flashlight beam dancing nervously over the polished caskets, Rule 2 was put to the test. In the Rose Room, where a Mrs. Eleanor Ainsworth lay in state, her casket, a heavy oak monstrosity, visibly shuddered. It wasn't a subtle tremor, it was a distinct, jarring movement, accompanied by a faint scraping sound against the velvet-draped bier. My breath hitched. Rushing to the east linen cabinet, my hands fumbling with the latch, I retrieved the shroud of silence, a heavy embroidered cloth of deep, unsettling purple. With trembling hands, I draped it over the coffin, the fabric cold and strangely heavy. Then came the 7 minutes of absolute silence. I stood with my back to the bier, eyes squeezed shut, focusing on my breathing, trying to ignore the frantic thumping of my own heart. The silence in the room was a living thing, pressing in on me, magnifying every tiny sound from within the casket. A soft creak of wood, a sigh like air escaping deflated lungs, and then, unmistakably, a low, guttural chuckle, muffled by the oak and the shroud, but undeniably there. It was a sound of pure, cold amusement, chilling me to the core. When the 7 minutes finally, agonizingly elapsed, I practically fled the room, the laughter echoing in my ears. The descent into the chapel alcove to check the offering drawer as per Rule 3 was undertaken with a sense of profound reluctance. The chapel was small, filled with the scent of dust and faded incense, the stained glass window depicting a sorrowful, angular saint casting mournful pools of color on the worn flagstones. The drawer, a small, unassuming thing of dark wood, was, as I had feared, empty. It gaped at me like a hungry mouth. My fingers closed around the small blue ribbon in my pocket, Emily's ribbon, a tangible piece of her light. The thought of consigning it to this demand, felt like a betrayal. With a heavy heart, I pulled out the ribbon. It was faded, the silk frayed at the edges, but it still held the faint scent of her, of sunshine and childhood innocence. Placing it in the drawer felt like tearing a piece of my own soul. As I closed it, the old tower clock outside began to chime, its mournful tones tolling the half-hour. A wave of desolation washed over me, so profound it nearly buckled my knees. It wasn't just a ribbon, it was a piece of her, a piece of us, now fed to the insatiable sorrow of this house. What right did this place have to demand such a sacrifice? The remainder of the night passed in a blur of heightened anxiety. Every shadow seemed to writhe with unseen movement. Every gust of wind carried a fresh wave of whispers, no longer bothering to be subtle. I found myself jumping at the slightest sound, my nerves frayed to their breaking point. The rules, which were supposed to provide a framework for navigating this nocturnal labyrinth, felt more like a series of impossible tests designed to provoke. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in bruised shades of purple and gray, a fragile sense of relief began to creep in. I had survived, somehow, but it was a hollow victory. The encounters of the night had stripped away any pretense of normalcy, revealing the raw, unsettling truth of Hollowvale. This was not a place of peaceful repose for the dead. It was a battleground, and the rules were not a shield, but a flimsy, tattered banner in a war I was only just beginning to comprehend. The first night was over, but the haunting laughter from the casket, the mocking whispers, the sacrifice of Emily's ribbon, these were just the opening salvos. The dead of Ethelberg were stirring, and their discontent was a palpable, growing force within these ancient walls. The second night descended upon Hollowvale with a more pronounced chill, an atmospheric pressure that seemed to squeeze the very air from my lungs. The lessons of the previous shift were etched into my mind, each failed rule a fresh scar on my already frayed nerves. I moved with a grim determination, no longer expecting peace, but rather anticipating the inevitable breaches of protocol from the mortuary's unseen residents. The silence itself felt different, not empty, but charged, like the breathless pause before a thunderstorm, pregnant with an unspoken volatile energy that vibrated through the floorboards and up my spine. Around 3 a.m., while conducting a sweep of the lower levels, I approached the preparation room. The door, usually closed, was slightly ajar, a sliver of impenetrable darkness visible within. As I reached for the handle, the overhead lights in the narrow corridor flickered erratically, and then, with a soft pop, plunged me into absolute blackness. My heart leaped into my throat. Rule 4. If the lights in the preparation room extinguish themselves. Though these were corridor lights, the proximity and the sudden deliberate nature of the outage felt like a clear summons. My hands trembled as I fumbled in my satchel for the emergency kit. The salt lantern, an archaic brass contraption, felt unnervingly heavy in my grasp. Its wick caught with a hesitant sputter, casting a meager dancing pool of orange light that did little to dispel the oppressive gloom. The shadows writhed at the edges of its reach, morphing into grotesque, elongated shapes. As I began the threshold chant, my voice wavering, the words feeling alien and clumsy on my tongue, a movement in the periphery of the lantern's glow caught my eye. I turned slowly, my blood running cold. There, standing just inside the darkened doorway of the preparation room, was the translucent figure of a boy. He couldn't have been more than 10, pale and sorrowful, his form flickering like a faulty projection. His eyes, wide and dark, were fixed on me with an expression of desperate urgency. This was no aggressive manifestation. This was something else entirely. He raised a trembling, almost transparent hand and pointed towards the floor, near the hulking silhouette of an embalming cable. As I finished the third repetition of the chant, my voice cracking on the final syllable, the boy, whom I would later learn was named Noah Carter, drifted closer, his lips moving, forming a single, silent word I strained to understand. He pointed again, more insistently, to a spot beneath the table. Hesitantly, I moved the salt lantern lower, its light revealing a section of the stone floor, darker than the rest, as if perpetually damp. And there, almost invisible in the grime and shadows, was an inscription, crudely etched into the stone. Elles oven aquele que rege. They listen to the one who governs. The script was old, the words chilling in their implication. The boy, Noah, nodded slowly, his spectral form wavering. He then mouthed another series of words, his voice a barely audible whisper that seemed to carry on the chilled air. They, the Regent. The name sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. This wasn't just random disquiet from individual spirits. This was orchestrated. Noah's ghostly presence lingered for a moment longer, his sorrowful eyes conveying a world of unspoken fear. He explained, in fragmented whispers that seemed to drain his ethereal energy, that the silent congregation, the collective dead of Hollowvale, was being stirred, their latent griefs and resentments amplified and manipulated by this entity, this regent of laments. He spoke of how the regent fed on the unresolved pain of Ethelberg, growing stronger with each new sorrow, each unmourned loss. Emily. Her name flashed in my mind like a brand. My unresolved grief, the town's collective memory of her tragic, unexplained death, were these contributing to this? This regent's power? Noah's form began to fade, his whispers becoming fainter. He uses the old pains, makes them new, stronger. His eyes fixed on me, a plea in their translucent depths. Your sister, her song is loud here. And then he was gone, dissolving into the shadows as if he'd never been, leaving only the faint scent of ozone and the chilling resonance of his words. The lights in the corridor flickered back on with a sudden harsh buzz, making me jump. The preparation room door was now firmly closed. I stood there for a long moment, the salt lantern still warm in my hand, the inscription on the floor a stark testament to the encounter. The Regent of Laments, a name for the faceless dread that permeated Hollowvale, a conductor for this symphony of sorrow. The rules, I realized with dawning horror, were not just failing, they were perhaps irrelevant, like trying to dam a tsunami with a handful of sand when the true force lay far out at sea, gathering its terrible strength. My shift ended, but sleep offered no refuge. Noah's words, his sorrowful face, the name of the regent, they echoed in the hollows of my mind. The dead weren't just restless, they were being rallied. and the implication that Emily's memory, my own private agony, was somehow a beacon for this malevolent force, twisted something deep inside me. The fight at Hollowvale was not just against the lingering spirits of the departed. It was against something far older, far more insidious, something that wore the collective grief of Ethelberg like a crown. And it seemed my own heart was an unwilling contributor to its dark reign. The thin light of another Ethelberg dawn did little to dispel the shadows that had taken root in my mind. Noah's revelation about the Regent of Laments had shifted the very ground beneath me. This wasn't just a haunted mortuary, it was a place under siege, and the rules were less a defense and more a series of increasingly futile appeasements. I sought out Mr. Whitmore as soon as he arrived, my voice tight with a mixture of fear and accusation as I recounted Noah's visitation and the chilling name he had uttered. The usual weariness in Whitmore's eyes deepened, lines of an ancient burden etched more sharply around his mouth. He didn't dismiss my story, didn't call me mad or overwrought. Instead, he listened with a grave attentiveness that was almost more unnerving. When I finished, he let out a long, slow sigh, the sound like air escaping a punctured lung. "The Regent," he murmured, the name tasting like ash on his tongue. "So, the old whispers are true. I had hoped it was merely the accumulated weight of years, the usual restlessness." He looked away, towards the grimy window overlooking the cemetery, its headstones like a fleet of gray sails on a sea of unkempt grass. This was not a new fear for him, I realized, but a confirmation of an old one. He confessed then, his voice low and strained, that Hollowvale had always been a focal point, a condenser, he called it, for the sorrows and unresolved griefs of Ethelberg. The Blackwood family, his ancestors, hadn't built it as a mere business, but had inherited its stewardship, a solemn, thankless duty passed down through generations. Their role, he explained, was to act as custodian. "The Regent of Laments," Whitmore continued, his gaze distant, "is not a new entity. It's a resonance, a manifestation of the deepest, most unyielding sorrows that have soaked into this very soil for centuries. It lies dormant for generations. Then, when the collective grief of the town reaches a certain pitch, it awakens. It feeds on that pain, amplifies it, and uses the restless dead as its chorus, its army." He paused, then looked directly at me, his eyes filled with a bleak understanding. "Unresolved deaths, great tragedies, these are like open wounds, Mr. Walker. Invitations. Your sister, Emily, her passing was such a wound for this town, for you. A cold fury mixed with a sickening wave of guilt washed over me. Are you saying Emily's death, my grief for her, is fueling this thing?" The accusation hung heavy in the stale air of his office. Whitmore didn't flinch. "All significant, unresolved sorrow contributes, Mr. Walker. The Regent is not selective in its appetite. It draws on any source of potent lament. And a child's untimely death, a mystery unsolved, that is a particularly potent vintage." His words were brutal, clinical, yet tinged with a strange, almost paternal sorrow. I felt a chasm open within me. The job I had taken out of financial desperation and a secret gnawing hope for answers about Emily was now implicated in the very horror I was facing. My pain, the private sanctuary of my mourning, was being weaponized by an ancient, unseen malevolence. And Whitmore, had he known? Had he hired me, the grieving brother, knowing my presence might somehow exacerbate the situation, or perhaps even act as some kind of perverse lightning rod? The thought was abhorrent, a betrayal that cut deeper than the fear. "Did you know about this regent, when you hired me?" I demanded, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. "Did you know what I might bring into this house?" Whitmore's expression remained unreadable for a long moment. "I knew Hollow Vale was unquiet," he admitted slowly. "More so than usual. I suspected an older pattern reasserting itself. As for you, Mr. Walker, I saw a man in need of work, a man with a connection to this town's sorrow. Perhaps," he added, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, "I hoped your presence might change the resonance. Or perhaps I was simply desperate for someone, anyone, willing to walk these halls at night." His ambiguity was infuriating, his half-confessions offering no solace, only deeper wells of doubt. I was trapped, not just by my financial obligations or my need for answers, but by a horrifying symbiosis where my deepest pain seemed to be nourishing the very darkness that had claimed my sister. The line between victim and unwitting accomplice blurred. Was I here to find peace for Emily, or was my presence merely tightening the Regent's grip on Hollowvale, on Offelberg itself? The rules, the nightly rituals, felt like a farce, a charade played out against a backdrop of profound, personal, and now cosmic betrayal. The Fractura was no longer just in the mortuary's failing defenses, but within me. My quest for closure was now horribly intertwined with the town's ancient malady. Each memory of Emily, once a source of bittersweet comfort, now felt like a potential offering to the Regent. Hollowvale was no longer just a place of work. It was a mirror reflecting my own internal torment, amplified and given monstrous form. And Mr. Charles Whitmore, the weary custodian of this house of sorrows, was either a fellow prisoner of its legacy or a far more subtle and more culpable player in this deadly game. The storm that broke over Ethelberg that third night was a physical manifestation of the chaos brewing within Hollowvale's walls. Rain lashed against the stained glass windows like angry fists, and the wind howled through the ancient eaves with the voice of a banshee. Inside, the mortuary seemed to respond in kind, the carefully constructed illusion of peace shattering like fragile glass. The night began with a cacophony of transgressions, as if the Susurros no longer waited for the appointed hour between 2 and 4. They were a constant, insidious chorus from the moment I locked the main doors, slithering from every shadow, every unlit corner. When I attempted the prescribed response, "The stars watch over your slumber, and I watch over the house," it was met not with derisive chuckles, but with a chillingly clear, multi-voiced retort that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. "The stars have fallen, Watcher, and the house is ours now." The collective voice was cold, devoid of emotion, yet filled with an undeniable, ancient authority. My blood turned to ice. In the grand viewing parlor, the caskets, 3 of them tonight, awaiting their final services, didn't just tremble. Their heavy lids creaked open, slowly, deliberately, revealing glimpses of shadowed forms within. I fumbled for the shroud of silence, my hands slick with sweat, but there were too many, and the directive of covering a coffin seemed pitifully inadequate against this coordinated display of defiance. As I hesitated, paralyzed by indecision and a burgeoning terror, a low moan emanated from one of the open caskets, followed by a single, clearly articulated word that ripped through the oppressive air. Emily. My heart stopped. It was a voice I didn't recognize, raspy and ancient, yet it spoke her name, my sister's name, a name that should never have been uttered within these unhallowed halls after sunset, a direct violation of Rule 5 by one of the Adormecidos themselves. The sound of it, so personal, so sacred to me, being spoken by one of them, felt like a desecration. A wave of nausea and rage washed over me. This was no longer about testing the rules. This was a direct, personal assault orchestrated by the Regent, using my deepest wound as its weapon. Then, from the darkest corner of the parlor, a figure began to coalesce. It was vaguely human in shape, but distorted, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. As it stepped into the flickering lamplight from the hallway, my breath caught in a ragged sob. It wore Emily's likeness, or a horrifying, twisted caricature of it. The eyes were hollow sockets of shadow, the smile a rictus of pain. This thing advanced on me, its voice a grotesque mimicry of my sister's childhood lilt. "You forgot me, Ethan," it whispered, its voice laced with an unnatural sorrow. "You didn't grieve enough. Your pain is too small, too quiet. The Regent demands more." I stumbled backward, a cry of denial trapped in my throat. This wasn't Emily. This was a monstrous puppet, animated by the Regent's malice, designed to break me. The Fita de Cabello, Emily's blue ribbon I had placed in the offering drawer with such reluctance, suddenly appeared in the apparition's hand. With a slow, deliberate movement, the Emily thing held the ribbon over an unlit candelabra on a nearby table. It burst into pale, ethereal flames, consuming the fragile silk in seconds, leaving behind only a wisp of acrid smoke and the scent of profound, irreversible loss. The offering drawer and its rule had become another tool of torment. The illusion of any control, any safety afforded by the archaic rules was utterly annihilated. This wasn't a subtle haunting, this was a siege. The phenomena escalated throughout the mortuary. Lights flickered and died in room after room, plunging vast sections into Stygian darkness, rendering the salt lantern and its chant a pathetic defense. Wet footprints, as per Rule 6, appeared not as a subtle trail to be followed, but as a veritable flood crisscrossing the main atrium, as if a legion had marched through from some watery grave, their source untraceable, their purpose terrifyingly unclear. The old organ in the chapel, silent for decades according to Mr. Whitmore, roared to life. Not with a single tentative melody, but with a discordant, deafening blast of sound, a symphony of madness. I found myself cowering in a small alcove off the main hall, the list of rules crumpled in my fist, its ink blurred by my sweat. They were meaningless now, a testament to a forgotten order, a world that no longer existed within these walls. The dead were not just disobeying, they were rewriting the terms of engagement, and their new rules were written in fear and despair. The house itself seemed to be groaning under the strain, the ancient timbers protesting as unseen forces tore at its foundations. Any hope I had clung to, any belief that I could navigate this nocturnal hell, was extinguished, leaving only the raw, primal terror of a man trapped in a nightmare from which there was no waking. Hollowvale had finally bared its teeth, and I was caught firmly in its jaws. The assault of that tempestuous night left Hollowvale Mortuary in a state of disarray that mirrored my own shattered psyche. Dawn brought not relief, but a grim illumination of the chaos. Furniture in the viewing rooms was overturned, floral arrangements lay scattered and crushed like fallen soldiers, and an unnerving silence had descended, a silence that felt more like a temporary ceasefire than a true cessation of hostilities. The rules, my flimsy shield against the encroaching darkness, were now nothing more than a collection of quaint, utterly irrelevant superstitions. The system Mr. Whitmore and his ancestors had so painstakingly maintained for generations had well and truly collapsed. When Mr. Whitmore arrived, his face, already etched with a chronic weariness, seemed to have aged a decade overnight. He surveyed the wreckage, the open caskets, the lingering scent of burned ribbon, the faint otherworldly chill that even the morning sun couldn't dispel, and a single, dry sob escaped his lips. "It's over," he whispered, his voice hoarse with defeat. "The old ways, they're not enough anymore. The Regent, it's too strong. It's close to breaking through entirely." He looked at me, his eyes hollow, reflecting a despair that mirrored my own. There was no blame, no accusation, only the shared understanding of men who had stared into the abyss and found it staring back. He confessed then that he had always feared this day, this complete unraveling. The Blackwood legacy was not one of triumph, but of a desperate, centuries-long holding action against an encroaching tide of sorrow. "We weren't masters of this place, Mr. Walker," he said, his voice barely audible above the mournful sigh of the wind outside. "We were its prisoners, just like the silent congregation. We only ever bought time, a little more quiet before the next storm. And now the storm has broken, and the levees are gone." His words painted a bleak picture of futility, of a family bound to a failing, cursed duty. The realization that I could not simply walk away, that my financial contract was now the least of my bindings to this place, settled upon me with an icy finality. Fleeing Athelberg, abandoning Hollowvale to its fate, felt not only impossible, but also like a profound betrayal, not just of Whitmore, but of Emily, of Noah, of all the trapped echoes within these walls. If the old system had failed, then a new approach was needed, though what that might be, I had no earthly idea. The raw, untamed power I had witnessed, the personal, venomous nature of the Regent's attacks, suggested that this was beyond mere ritual or appeasement. Mr. Whitmore, as if sensing my desperate internal calculus, led me to his private study, a room I hadn't entered before, tucked away behind the main office. It was less an office and more a scholar's den, crammed with bookshelves overflowing with ancient leather-bound volumes, their spines cracked and faded. He pulled one down, its cover unadorned, its pages brittle and filled with a spidery, archaic script. "My great-great-grandfather's journal," he explained, handing it to me with trembling fingers. He faced a similar surge of what he called the Great Lament in his time. Perhaps there's something in here, some forgotten knowledge. His hope was a fragile thing, but it was something. He admitted he had pored over these texts for years, finding only partial answers, fragmented rituals that had long since lost their efficacy against the evolving, strengthening sorrow of Ethelberg. "The Regent learns, Mr. Walker," he said grimly. "It adapts. What worked once may only provoke it now." This was not a battle of wits or strength, I began to understand, but something far more fundamental, something that required a deeper understanding of the wound itself, the original trauma that had birthed this cyclical torment upon the town and its dead. The journal was dense, filled with cryptic allusions, observations of celestial alignments, and sketches of strange sigils. But amidst the arcane ramblings, a recurring theme emerged: the idea of a prime echo, an original source of the town's profound sorrow, a wound so deep it had never truly healed, only festered beneath the surface. My ancestor believed that the regent was not the source itself, but an amplification, a monstrous resonance of this primary, unaddressed grief. If that original echo could be understood, perhaps even soothed, then the regent's power might wane. This shifted my perspective entirely. I was no longer just a knight attendant, a reluctant rule follower. I was, by default, an investigator of Ethelberg's deepest, darkest secret. The rules were a distraction, a symptom of a misunderstanding of the true nature of the affliction. The spirits weren't inherently malevolent, not all of them. They were trapped, their own sorrows twisted and amplified by a greater, older pain. Noah's guidance, his desperate plea for them to be heard, suddenly took on a new, profound meaning. My task was no longer to silence them, but to listen, to understand the language of their lament. The collapse of Hollowvale's old order, terrifying as it was, had also, perversely, cleared the path. The pretense was gone. Mr. Whitmore, stripped of his ancestral certainty, was now a hesitant ally rather than an enigmatic employer. And I, Ethan Walker, grieving brother and accidental custodian of the night, found myself standing at a new threshold, armed not with rules, but with a tattered journal and the terrifying dawning realization that the key to Hollowvale's, and perhaps my own, lay buried deep within the forgotten heart of Ethelberg's first and greatest sorrow. The path ahead was shrouded in darkness, but for the first time it felt like a path I had chosen, however unwillingly. The days that followed the collapse of Hollowvale's ritualistic defenses were steeped in a tense, almost unbearable quiet. The nights, however, remained a battleground, though the nature of the conflict had subtly shifted. The overt, aggressive displays of the silent congregation lessened, replaced by a more insidious, pervasive atmosphere of sorrow, a palpable weight of despair that threatened to suffocate anyone who lingered too long within the mortuary's walls. Armed with my great-great-grandfather Whitmore's journal, I began to treat Hollowvale not as a place to be managed, but as an ancient, wounded patient whose symptoms I needed to diagnose before any healing could begin. Noah Carter's spectral appearances became more frequent, though no less sorrowful. He seemed to sense the change in my approach, the shift from fear-driven obedience to a desperate, investigative resolve. He couldn't speak for long, his form too unstable, but his gestures, his insistent pointing towards the older, disused sections of the mortuary, became my compass. He led me away from the grand viewing rooms and the sterile functionality of the modern wings, down into the labyrinthine cellars and forgotten storerooms, places where the dust lay thick as shrouds and the air tasted of centuries. It was in the deepest sub-basement, a place Mr. Whitmore himself confessed he had rarely ventured, that Noah's guidance culminated. Behind a crumbling section of stone wall, hidden by fallen timbers and cobwebs that hung like macabre tapestries, was a low, arched doorway I would never have found on my own. The air emanating from it was colder, more ancient, carrying a faint metallic tang that reminded me unpleasantly of old blood. Beyond the doorway lay a small, circular chamber, its walls lined with niches half filled with decaying wooden boxes and fragile, time-eaten scrolls. This was not a crypt, but an archive of forgotten sorrows. As I carefully examined the contents, my flashlight beam disturbing colonies of spiders and revealing layers of undisturbed dust, I began to piece together the prime echo the journal had alluded to. Faded letters, brittle parish records, and crudely drawn maps told a horrifying tale from Aethelberg's earliest days, nearly 3 centuries prior. A devastating plague, the Crimson Sweats, had swept through the fledgling settlement, wiping out nearly half its inhabitants within a single, brutal winter. The survivors, terrified and desperate, had turned on a small group of healers and herbalists, women who had tried to fight the sickness with their traditional remedies, accusing them of witchcraft, of bringing the plague upon them as a curse. These women, according to the fragmented accounts, were not given trials, but were betrayed by their own community, rounded up, and sealed alive within a hastily constructed ossuary, a place of mass burial intended to contain both the plague victims and, it seemed, the witches blamed for their demise. The location described for this crude ossuary, this monument to fear and betrayal, corresponded with uncanny precision to the very ground upon which Hollowvale Mortuary now stood. The Regent of Laments was not just a vague spiritual malaise, it was the concentrated, unexpiated rage and sorrow of these betrayed women, these first, most grievously wronged souls of Aethelberg. Their pain, their sense of ultimate injustice, had become the festering wound, the prime echo that pulsed beneath the town, calling out to and amplifying every subsequent sorrow, every unresolved death, turning Hollowvale into its unwilling amplifier. And then, tucked within a small, lead-lined casket that seemed to radiate a palpable coldness, I found it. A simple, crudely carved wooden whistle, smooth and dark with age, lying beside a small, tattered piece of parchment. On the parchment, in a spidery, faded script, was a fragment of a lullaby, its melody hinted at by archaic notation. The journal entry for that period described such whistles being used by the Earth Mothers, the healers, to soothe fevers, to calm troubled spirits, to sing the dying gently into their final sleep. This whistle, this song, had belonged to one of them, perhaps their leader, the first to be walled up with the screams of her accusers still ringing in her ears. As I held the whistle, a strange resonance hummed through it, a faint vibration that seemed to echo in my own bones. And then, a memory, sharp and unbidden, pierced through the gloom. Emily, years ago, a small girl with a bright, inquisitive smile, holding a cheap plastic whistle I'd won for her at a summer fair. She'd been so proud of it, convinced it could summon birds or calm stormy weather. She had even tried to draw it, a child's earnest, clumsy depiction of a whistle, tucked away in one of her old sketchbooks I hadn't been able to open since her death. The connection, so unexpected, so poignant, sent a jolt through me. This ancient sorrow, this prime echo, was not just a historical tragedy. It was now intimately, terrifyingly linked to my own deepest loss. The discovery of the chamber, the story of the betrayed healers, the wooden whistle, and the fragment of the lullaby, these were not just clues, they were a potential key. The journal had hinted that the Great Lament could not be fought with force, nor appeased by hollow ritual. It needed to be acknowledged, its original pain witnessed, and perhaps grieved anew by someone willing to face its depths without flinching. The strategy was no longer about containment or evasion. It was about a direct, empathetic engagement with the source of Aethelberg's centuries-old torment. And the tools for that engagement, it seemed, had just fallen into my trembling hands. The weight of the ancient wooden whistle in my palm felt disproportionate to its size, a fragile relic imbued with centuries of silent suffering. The fragmented lullaby from the parchment replayed in my mind, a melody both haunting and strangely soothing. The path forward, though terrifying, was clearer now than it had ever been under the failing aegis of Hollowvale's archaic rules. I couldn't fight the regent of laments with salt lanterns or prescribed phrases. I had to meet its pain with an understanding born of my own, to reach back to the prime echo, the original betrayal that fueled its sorrowful reign. I found Mr. Whitmore in his study, the very picture of desolation, surrounded by his useless books of lore. I laid out my discoveries: the hidden chamber, the story of the betrayed healers, the whistle, and the lullaby. As I spoke, a flicker of something other than despair ignited in his tired eyes, a hesitant spark of, could it be hope? Or perhaps just the grim recognition of a truth his ancestors had only skirted around. He listened intently, his fingers tracing the lines on his own worn desk, as if seeking an answer in the grain of the wood. "The Earth Mothers," he murmured when I finished, the term from his great-great-grandfather's journal. Yes, he spoke of them, of a forgotten song, a key of solace. He believed their spirits were not malevolent in origin, but twisted by the injustice, their lament becoming a contagion. He looked at the whistle in my hand. He searched for such a relic, a direct link to them, but never found it. He believed it was the only way to retune the resonance, as he put it. This was it then, a desperate gamble, a fragile hope unearthed from the deepest, darkest roots of Ethelberg. Our plan, if such a desperate improvisation could be called a plan, was simple in its terrifying audacity. We would return to the hidden chamber, the symbolic heart of the prime echo. There, I would attempt to play the lullaby on the ancient whistle, not as a challenge or an exorcism, but as an offering, an act of remembrance and empathy for those first betrayed souls. My own grief for Emily, which the regent had so cruelly tried to weaponize, would be my conduit, the emotional current through which I hoped to connect with that older, foundational sorrow. It was a profound risk. Such a direct engagement could very well shatter what remained of my sanity, or worse. Mr. Whitmore, to my surprise, did not try to dissuade me. Instead, a grim resolve seemed to settle over him. "If this is to be done," he said, his voice steadier than I had heard it in days, "then it must be done correctly. My ancestor wrote of creating a hallowed space, a circle of protection, not to bind, but to focus the intent, to shield the caller from the raw backlash of the awakening." He began pulling down specific volumes, his movements now imbued with a purpose I hadn't seen before. He spoke of chalk lines, of specific herbs to be burned for clarity and warding, of incantations not of banishment, but of invitation and safe passage. The preparations took the remainder of the day. We worked in a tense, focused silence, the air in Hollowvale thick with anticipation. Mrs. Brooks watched us from the periphery, her ancient eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something akin to awe. She offered no words, only a single, slow nod when we passed her, carrying supplies down into the sub-basement. Even the usual nightly stirrings of the silent congregation seemed muted, as if the house itself were holding its breath, aware that something pivotal was about to occur. The veil between worlds felt thinner than ever. As twilight bled into true night, we descended into the hidden chamber. Mr. Whitmore, his face illuminated by the flickering light of a single lantern, meticulously drew a large circle on the dusty stone floor with chalk infused with powdered rowan and iron filings, murmuring phrases in a language I didn't recognize, his voice a low, resonant drone. Within this circle, he placed small braziers, lighting dried bundles of sage, lavender, and what he called grave mullein, their smoke coiling towards the low ceiling, carrying a scent that was both earthy and strangely comforting. I stood in the center of the circle, the ancient whistle clutched in my hand. It felt strangely warm now, almost alive. The fragmented lullaby echoed in my mind, interwoven with memories of Emily, her laughter, her trusting eyes, the devastating emptiness of her absence. This was not an act of courage, I knew, but of sheer, desperate necessity. If I failed, the Regent would likely consume what was left of Hollowvale, and perhaps Aethelberg itself. If I succeeded, I didn't dare to think that far ahead. Success felt like an alien concept in this place of perpetual sorrow. Mr. Whitmore completed his preparations, stepping back just outside the chalk line. "The space is prepared, Mr. Walker," he said, his voice low. "It will offer some measure of protection, but the connection, that must come from you, from the truth of your intent." He met my gaze, his own filled with a heavy solemnity. "May whatever gods or guardians still listen to this forsaken town guide your breath." With that, he fell silent, a lone sentinel at the edge of a precipice I was about to step over. The only sounds were the hiss of the burning herbs and the frantic thumping of my own heart. It was time. Time to play the song of the lost, and pray it was a song of healing, not a prelude to utter annihilation. Raising the ancient wooden whistle to my lips, I took a ragged breath. The air in the chamber was thick with the smoke of the sacred herbs, the scent sharp and purifying, yet beneath it I could still detect the faint, cold aroma of old stone and even older grief. My fingers trembled as I positioned them over the crudely bored holes. The silence stretched, taut and expectant, broken only by the crackle of the braziers and Mr. Whitmore's shallow, nervous breathing from just outside the chalk circle. Then I blew. The first note was hesitant, reedy, almost lost in the oppressive stillness. But it was a sound, an ancient voice given breath after centuries of silence. As I fumbled through the first few notes of the fragmented lullaby, piecing together the melody from memory and instinct, the very atmosphere in the chamber began to shift. A profound coldness emanated from the walls, a chill that bit deep into my bones, far colder than any night I had yet experienced in Hollowvale. The lantern light flickered violently, casting dancing, distorted shadows that writhed like tormented spirits. From the niches lining the walls, where the decaying boxes and scrolls lay, came a collective sigh, a mournful exhalation that seemed to carry the weight of untold suffering. The Regent of Laments was stirring, its attention drawn by the ancient call. A towering figure began to coalesce in the space before me, just beyond the edge of my vision, yet its presence was overwhelming, a vortex of concentrated sorrow and rage. It was not a single entity, but a composite, a swirling maelstrom of shadow and light, within which I could glimpse fleeting faces, the anguished visages of the silent congregation, their eyes burning with a cold, sorrowful fire. And at its heart, a darker, more defined core, a being of pure, unadulterated grief, its form vaguely feminine, its power immense. This was the Regent, the prime echo given monstrous, sentient form. It spoke, its voice not a single sound, but a chorus of lamentation, a symphony of pain that resonated directly within my skull, bypassing my ears entirely. It showed me Emily. Not the comforting memory, but her final, terrifying moments, twisted and amplified, her fear, her confusion, her small, broken body by the Weeping Willow Creek. It hurled my deepest guilts at me like poisoned darts. You weren't there. You couldn't protect her. Your grief is a mockery, a pale imitation of true suffering. The assault was relentless, designed to shatter my resolve, to drown me in my own despair, to make me one of its chorus. Tears streamed down my face, a torrent of renewed agony, but clutched in my hand, the whistle felt like an anchor. And through the regent's psychic onslaught, another image fought its way through. Emily, not as a victim, but as she was in life, bright and vibrant, holding her cheap plastic whistle, her face alight with innocent joy. The drawing I'd found, her clumsy depiction of that simple toy, superimposed itself over the horrific visions. The regent's pain, I realized with a sudden, startling clarity, was a mirror of my own, magnified 1,000-fold, festering for centuries, but born of the same fundamental human experience of loss and injustice. It wasn't just a monster, it was a wound. My fingers found a new certainty on the whistle. The melody shifted. It was no longer the fragmented, archaic lullaby from the parchment. Instead, what emerged was a different song, a simple, almost childish tune that rose unbidden from the depths of my memory. A lullaby my mother used to sing to Emily and me when we were small. A song of comfort, of safety, of unconditional love. The notes were clear, pure, infused not with fear or a desire to banish, but with the raw, honest ache of my love for my lost sister, and a dawning empathy for the ancient, betrayed souls before me. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The towering figure of the regent recoiled, its shadowy form flickering, the chorus of lamentation faltering, a note of confusion, of surprise entering its multi-voiced cry. The anguished faces within its vortex seemed to soften, their spectral eyes losing some of their cold fire, replaced by a deep, fathomless sadness. The onslaught of horrific visions ceased. For a breathless moment, there was only the sound of the simple lullaby, echoing in the ancient chamber, a fragile beacon of human love against an abyss of despair. Then she appeared. Not the monstrous regent, but a single translucent figure detaching itself from the swirling shadows. A woman, her features noble yet etched with an unimaginable sorrow, her spectral garments those of a bygone era. One of the Earth Mothers, perhaps their leader. She didn't speak, but her eyes filled with an ancient pain that was slowly, almost imperceptibly, being touched by a glimmer of recognition? Peace? She raised a hand, not in threat, but as if in acknowledgement. And beside me, so faint I almost thought I imagined it, I felt a fleeting, comforting presence. Emily. Just for a heartbeat, her small, spectral hand seemed to rest on mine, guiding the melody, her familiar, mischievous smile gracing her lips, before she, too, faded like mist. The lullaby ended. The last note hung in the air, trembling, before dissolving into a silence that was no longer oppressive, but empty, exhausted. The figure of the Earth Mother gave a slow, solemn nod, then began to recede, rejoining the now quiescent, retreating shadows of the regent. The oppressive cold in the chamber lessened, the lantern light steadied. The overwhelming presence of rage and sorrow had not vanished, but it had withdrawn, like a tide receding from a ravaged shore, leaving behind a profound, aching stillness. I lowered the whistle, my body trembling, every ounce of my emotional and spiritual energy utterly depleted. I had met the absolute, and somehow we had both survived. In the aftermath of the lullaby, the hidden chamber beneath Hollowvale seemed to exhale a collective sigh that had been held for centuries. The oppressive, malevolent energy that had choked its stones had significantly diminished, replaced by a profound, almost sacred quietude. The Regent of Laments, or rather the prime echo of the Earth Mother's sorrow it embodied, had not been destroyed or banished. Such a deep wound could not be so easily erased. But it had retreated. It felt as though a great knotted tension had been loosened, the raw agony at its core acknowledged, and for the first time, perhaps, truly mourned without the filter of fear or rage. The figure of the Earth Mother gave a slow, solemn nod. Mr. Whitmore, his face pale but his eyes wide with a dawning, incredulous relief, slowly entered the chalk circle. He looked around the chamber, at the niches where the ancient relics lay, at the spot where the Regent's terrifying form had manifested. "It's different," he breathed, his voice hushed with awe. "The air, it's lighter. The bitterness is gone." He turned to me, a complex emotion in his gaze, gratitude, respect, and a deep, shared exhaustion. "What you did, Mr. Walker, I don't think even my ancestors dared to hope for such an understanding." The ancient wooden whistle, which had felt so alive in my hands, now lay inert on the stone floor where I had dropped it. As Mr. Whitmore bent to retrieve it, it crumbled at his touch, dissolving into a fine, dark dust that mingled with the ancient grime of the chamber. Its purpose served, its energy expended, it returned to the earth from which it had come. The fragile parchment with the lullaby fragment, which I still clutched, also seemed to have aged further, its ink barely visible, as if its song, too, had finally found its release. In the days and weeks that followed, a palpable change settled over Hollowvale Mortuary. The nightly stirrings of the silent congregation did not cease entirely. Some echoes, some sorrows, are too deeply ingrained to vanish completely, but their nature transformed. The whispers were less demanding, more like faint, distant memories. The occasional tremor of a casket felt more like a sigh of release than a gesture of defiance. The rules, once a desperate litany of containment, became obsolete, replaced by a quiet, intuitive awareness. The house still held its griefs, but they no longer festered with the same intensity. My own transformation was profound. The sharp, unrelenting edge of my guilt and sorrow over Emily's death had softened. The encounter with the Regent, the brief, luminous presence of Emily's spirit joining mine in that shared lullaby, had brought not closure, for some losses there is no true closure, but a form of peace and acceptance. The gaping wound in my soul had begun to scar over, no longer a source of constant agonizing pain, but a tender place of memory and love. The Regent had sought to feed on my grief, but in offering it with empathy, I had somehow found a measure of healing for us both. The oppressive atmosphere that had long choked Ethelberg also seemed to lift, however subtly. Mrs. Brooks, her knowing eyes now holding a softer light, remarked one morning that the birds seemed to sing a little louder, that the townsfolk seemed to carry their burdens with a touch more grace. The change was not dramatic, not a sudden miracle, but a slow, almost imperceptible easing of a centuries-old pressure. The prime echo, having been acknowledged, no longer needed to scream its pain through the conduit of every new sorrow. Mr. Whitmore began the painstaking process of researching the true history of the Earth Mothers, determined to see them officially recognized, their names cleared, their story told. He spoke of creating a small memorial garden on Hollowvale's grounds, a place of true remembrance, not of fear. The stewardship of Hollowvale was no longer about containment, but about compassionate witness, about understanding that the dead, like the living, sometimes just need their stories to be heard, their pain to be acknowledged without judgment. As for me, a strange transference had occurred. I had come to Hollowvale seeking answers about one death, and in doing so had become entangled in the fate of countless others. The sensitivity I had developed to the mortuary's unseen currents didn't fade. I could still feel the ebb and flow of its sorrow, the lingering echoes of its past. I hadn't gained any supernatural powers, but I had acquired a deeper, more intuitive understanding of grief, its myriad forms, its persistent voice. The role of night attendant, once a job of grim necessity, had become something else entirely, a quiet, ongoing vigil. The weight of my experience was immense, yet it was not a crushing burden. It was the weight of knowledge, of having touched something ancient and profound, of having played a small part in easing a pain that had spanned centuries. The shadows in Hollowvale were still there, as were the sorrows of Ethelberg, but they no longer held the same terrifying power. They were now part of a larger, more complex tapestry of existence, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, a single shared song of empathy can, sometimes, make all the difference. 6 months have passed since the night I played the lullaby in the hidden heart of Hollowvale. Life in Ethelberg continues its quiet, melancholic rhythm, but the undercurrent of oppressive dread has noticeably receded, like a fever that has finally broken, leaving behind a fragile, convalescent peace. I still walk the shadowed halls of the mortuary each night, but my role has irrevocably changed. I am no longer an enforcer of arcane rules, but a listener, a quiet custodian of the house's lingering whispers and fading sorrows. The old list of rules gathers dust in a forgotten drawer, a relic of a more fearful time. Hollowvale Mortuary itself feels different, breathing more easily. Mr. Whitmore, with a newfound vigor that belies his age, has thrown himself into his research, unearthing more details about the Earth Mothers, working with local historians to reclaim their narrative from centuries of fear and misrepresentation. Plans for the memorial garden are underway, a quiet space of hawthorn and willow, where the names of the betrayed healers will finally be spoken with reverence instead of dread. He often consults me, valuing my intuition, as he calls it, regarding the placement of certain stones or the choice of particular herbs for the garden. My mother's health has taken a remarkable turn for the better. The suffocating grief that had clung to her since Emily's death has loosened its grip. Her laughter, once a forgotten sound, now occasionally graces our small cottage. It's as if the easing of Ethelberg's collective sorrow has had a ripple effect, touching even those seemingly removed from Hollowvale's direct influence. Or perhaps my own fragile peace has, in some small way, radiated outwards, a quiet counterpoint to the regent's former lament. I dare not analyze it too closely, content to simply witness this unexpected blossoming of hope. Noah Carter's spectral form appears less frequently now, and when he does, the profound sorrow in his young eyes has been replaced by a serene, almost wistful calm. He no longer points or pleads, but sometimes just sits quietly in the periphery of my vision, a silent companion in the long watches of the night. The silent congregation, too, has largely fallen silent, their rest seemingly less troubled, their need to be heard assuaged by the acknowledgement of the prime echo that once so fiercely ignited their disquiet. The terrible, vivid nightmares of Emily's final moments have faded, replaced by softer, gentler dreams of her as she was in life, laughing, vibrant, her blue ribbon trailing in the summer breeze. The acute, stabbing pain of her absence has mellowed into a dull, persistent ache, a scar that reminds me not of failure, but of love, of connection, of a lullaby shared across the vale. I visit her grave by the Weeping Willow Creek often, no longer with the crushing weight of guilt, but with a quiet sense of acceptance, leaving wildflowers instead of tears. I know the Regent of Laments, or the deep sorrow it represents, is not entirely gone from Ethelberg. Such ancient wounds do not simply vanish. It sleeps now, its rage soothed, its power diminished, but it remains part of the town's spiritual bedrock, a dormant volcano whose potential for eruption can never be entirely discounted. My role, and perhaps Mr. Whitmore's, is now one of gentle, ongoing vigilance, of ensuring that the town's new griefs are met with compassion and understanding, lest they accumulate and once again stir the slumbering giant. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind whispers through the eaves of Hollow Vale, I can almost hear a faint, distant echo of the Earth Mother's lullaby. Not a song of sorrow, but of quiet endurance, of a peace hard won. I am no longer just Ethan Walker, the grieving brother who stumbled into a haunted legacy. I am a keeper of stories, a tender of old wounds, a man who learned that the deepest darkness can sometimes be met not with defiance, but with a shared song. Ethelberg will always be a town of shadows and memories, its history etched into its very stones. But now there is also a fragile sense of hope, a belief that even the most profound sorrows can, with empathy and acknowledgement, find a measure of solace. My future here is uncertain, but my purpose feels strangely clear. The night shift at Hollow Vale Mortuary continues, not governed by fear, but by a quiet understanding that the dead, much like the living, simply wish for their stories to be heard, their burdens to be lightened, and their journey into the great unknown to be undertaken with a measure of peace. And perhaps, in listening to their echoes, I am finally learning to quiet the most troubled whispers within myself.